Tonight on Gilded Hearts, we unfold a story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about love, revenge, and the price of pride. In the glittering world of Manhattan's elite, where billion-dollar empires rise and fall on whispered secrets, one man's thirst for vengeance is about to become his greatest downfall. This is the story of Adrian Kane, a billionaire whose heart turned to ice the day he believed his wife betrayed him. It's the story of Elena Marquez, a woman who lost everything but discovered strength she never knew she possessed. And it's the story of a secret so powerful, so shocking, that it would shake the very foundations of New York's high society. What happens when a billionaire's carefully orchestrated plan for humiliation becomes the very weapon that destroys him? When the woman he cast aside walks back into his world carrying truth more devastating than any lie. Tonight, you'll witness a reckoning 3 years in the making. Picture this. The Plaza Hotel, Manhattan's crown jewel, transformed into a cathedral of wealth and power. 500 of New York's most influential figures gathered for what was meant to be the social event of the decade. Crystal chandeliers casting diamonds of light across designer gowns worth more than most people's homes. The air thick with the scent of imported orchids and the whispered conversations of those who shaped the world with their money and influence. At the altar stands Adrian Kane, 34 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of perfectly tailored masculinity in a tuxedo that costs more than a luxury car. Storm gray eyes that have stared down CEOs and made grown men tremble, a jawline carved from marble, and hands that have signed deals worth billions. Tonight, those hands are about to receive a wedding ring from Victoria Sterling, the woman he chose to replace the wife he destroyed. But this isn't just any wedding. This is an elaborate theater of revenge, a stage set for one woman's ultimate humiliation. You see, somewhere in that glittering crowd, Adrian expects to see Elena Marquez, the woman he once loved with a passion that burned through his veins like fire. The woman he now believes betrayed him in the cruelest way imaginable. He's invited her here not as a guest of honor, but as the audience for his triumph. He wants her to watch him pledge his life to another woman. He wants her to understand, once and for all, what she lost when she chose betrayal over love. A wedding. A revenge plot. A child who looks exactly like his father. And one woman brave enough to walk into the lion's den with a truth that will change everything. But Adrian Kane has made one fatal miscalculation. The woman he remembers, the broken, grief-stricken wife who couldn't even look at him after their loss, no longer exists. In her place stands someone far more dangerous, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to reveal. Elena Marquez is coming to his wedding, but not as the humiliated exile he expects. She's coming with a secret that will turn his moment of triumph into his greatest nightmare. She's coming with living, breathing proof of the love that once bound them together and the lies that tore them apart. She's coming with a 4-year-old boy whose storm gray eyes and strong jawline are an exact mirror of the man standing at that altar. For 3 years, Elena has protected this secret, raised this child in the shadows of her former life, built a world where love could flourish away from the poison of Manhattan's elite. But tonight, she steps back into that glittering world with the one weapon Adrian Kane never saw coming. The son he never knew existed. The child conceived in love, but born into exile. The living proof that everything Adrian believes about that night, about their marriage, about her betrayal, is a carefully constructed lie. Before we begin this emotional journey, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love connecting with our beautiful community around the world. And there's something magical about knowing this story is reaching hearts across continents, that somewhere right now, someone just like you is settling in to experience this journey of love, loss, and redemption. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next heart-wrenching story we share. These tales of passion and betrayal, of second chances and devastating choices, they're more than just entertainment. They're mirrors that reflect our own hopes and fears, our own capacity for love and forgiveness. And if this story moves you, and trust me, it will, like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because together, we can reach more beautiful minds like yours, people who understand that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the deepest pain, that sometimes love requires us to walk through fire to reach the other side. You see, this isn't just a story about billionaires and revenge. It's a story about every woman who has ever been wronged, every mother who has sacrificed everything to protect her child, every person who has had to choose between safety and truth. It's about the moment when we stop running from our past and turn to face it head-on, no matter the consequences. Elena Marquez understands that moment intimately. For 3 years, she's lived in a small town 2 hours north of Manhattan, working double shifts at a local diner to pay rent on a modest apartment she shares with her son. Her hands, once soft from expensive creams and manicures, are now calloused from washing dishes and wiping tables. Her wardrobe consists of second-hand clothes and the single black dress she wears to parent-teacher conferences. But her eyes, those almond-shaped brown eyes that once captured a billionaire's heart, still carry the same quiet strength that made Adrian Kane fall in love with her in the first place. She never expected to see that wedding invitation slide under her door. The cream-colored envelope with its gold embossing, the formal script announcing the union of Adrian Kane and Victoria Sterling. For a moment, holding that invitation in her trembling hands, Elena was transported back to her own wedding day. The Plaza Hotel, the same venue where Adrian now plans to humiliate her. She could still remember the weight of her Vera Wang gown, the way Adrian's eyes had filled with tears when she walked down the aisle, the promises they made to each other in front of God and 500 witnesses. Promises that were broken not by infidelity or cruelty, but by something far more devastating. The inability to trust. The willingness to believe lies over love. The pride that turned a marriage into a battlefield where the only casualties were truth and hope. But as Elena stared at that invitation, her 4-year-old son Lucas looked up from his coloring book and asked the question that changed everything. "Mama, why are you crying?" Those storm-gray eyes, so achingly familiar, filled with concern for the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a life free from the toxic world of his father's empire. In that moment, Elena realized she wasn't just protecting Lucas anymore. She was teaching him that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. That night, after Lucas fell asleep, Elena sat at her kitchen table with a pen and paper, writing and rewriting the same letter. A letter to Adrian Kane, the man who had destroyed her life based on lies. A letter she would never send, because words on paper could never carry the weight of what she had to show him. Instead, she made a decision that would require every ounce of courage she possessed. She would go to his wedding. Not as the broken woman he expected, not as the humiliated exile seeking forgiveness, but as a mother defending her child's right to exist in a world that had tried to erase him. She would walk into that ballroom wearing the only designer dress she still owned, a midnight blue silk gown she'd worn to their last anniversary dinner, the night before everything fell apart. She would hold her son's hand and show Adrian Kane exactly what his pride and prejudice had cost him. 3 years of bedtime stories he'd never heard. 3 years of first words, first steps, first days of school. 3 years of a little boy asking why he didn't have a daddy like the other children. 3 years of Elena's heart breaking a little more each time she had to explain that sometimes daddies go away and don't come back, even when they never really knew they had left in the first place. But this story begins long before that wedding invitation, long before the lies that tore a marriage apart, long before a child was born into a world that didn't want him. This story begins with love. Pure, passionate, transformative love between two people who should have been each other's salvation, but instead became each other's destruction. It begins with Elena Marquez at 28, an event coordinator with dreams bigger than her queen's apartment and a heart generous enough to see past the walls that money and power build around a person. And it begins with Adrian Kane at 31, a man who had built an empire from nothing but had never learned how to build a family, a man whose greatest strength, his ability to cut losses and move forward, would become his greatest weakness when applied to matters of the heart. Their love story started like something out of a fairy tale, but fairy tales, as Elena would learn, don't prepare you for the moment when the prince becomes the villain of your story. They don't prepare you for the moment when happily ever after becomes the beginning of your worst nightmare. And they certainly don't prepare you for the moment when you have to walk back into that fairy tale with a secret that will either redeem it or destroy it completely. Tonight, you'll witness that moment. You'll see what happens when love and revenge collide in a ballroom filled with Manhattan's elite. You'll discover how far a mother will go to protect her child, and how much a man can lose when he chooses pride over truth. You'll experience a story where every character believes they're fighting for justice, but only one of them understands what justice really costs. This is a story about the price of assumptions, the power of secrets, and the moment when the past refuses to stay buried. It's about second chances and first meetings, about the children who pay for their parents' mistakes and the parents who must choose between safety and truth. But most of all, it's about a woman named Elena who walked into hell wearing designer silk and holding the hand of an angel who looks exactly like the devil who cast them both out. The question that will echo through every moment of this story, every revelation and every confrontation, is this: when the truth finally comes to light, when all the lies are stripped away and all the secrets are revealed, will love be strong enough to survive what pride and prejudice have destroyed? That answer lies waiting in a ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, in the eyes of a 4-year-old boy who has never met his father, and in the heart of a woman who is about to discover that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply showing someone the truth they were too proud to see. Elena Marquez was 31 years old when her world shattered into a million pieces, each fragment reflecting a different version of the woman she used to be. But to understand the magnitude of her fall, we must first witness the breathtaking heights from which she tumbled. This is the story of a love so pure it seemed destined for eternity, and so fragile it couldn't survive the poison of doubt. Picture Elena at 28, her hands stained with paint from the canvases she created in her tiny studio apartment in Queens. The daughter of Maria Marquez, a seamstress who worked 16-hour days in Manhattan's garment district, and Carlos Marquez, a taxi driver who knew every shortcut through the city's maze of ambition and broken dreams. Elena grew up watching her mother's fingers bleed from needle pricks, listening to her father's stories about the powerful people he drove to their glass towers while he returned each night to a one-bedroom apartment where dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. But Elena possessed something that couldn't be bought or inherited. A scholarship to Columbia University opened doors her parents had never imagined existed. While her classmates discussed their trust funds over champagne brunches, Elena waited tables at 3 different restaurants, her art history textbooks propped open beside industrial dishwashers, memorizing the brushstrokes of masters while her own hands pruned from soapy water. It was her professor, Dr. Margaret Whitfield, who first noticed Elena's gift for seeing beauty where others saw only business. Not just in paintings or sculptures, but in people, in moments, in the small details that transform ordinary gatherings into unforgettable experiences. When Dr. Whitfield recommended Elena for a position coordinating charity events for Manhattan's elite, Elena hesitated. She knew she didn't belong in that world of designer gowns and inherited fortunes, where people spent more on a single evening than her family earned in a year. But something deeper than ambition drove her to accept. Elena had grown up watching her parents sacrifice everything for her education, and she understood that sometimes we must enter worlds where we don't belong in order to create the world where we do. Her first event was a disaster. The flowers wilted, the caterer arrived an hour late, and Elena spent the evening in a borrowed black dress that was 2 sizes too large, apologizing to donors whose single contributions could have paid her student loans. But even in failure, there was something about Elena that caught attention. The way she handled crisis with grace, the way she remembered every guest's name, the way she made millionaires feel genuinely welcomed rather than merely solicited. Word spread through Manhattan's charity circuit like wildfire. Elena Marquez, the girl from Queens who could transform a simple fundraiser into an evening people talked about for months. Soon, she was coordinating galas for the Metropolitan Opera, benefits for children's hospitals, auctions where single lots sold for more money than most people saw in their lifetimes. But it was the Met Gala charity auction 3 years before her wedding that changed everything. The theme was timeless beauty, and Elena had spent weeks transforming the museum's grand hall into something that looked like a Renaissance palace. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble columns draped in silk, while string quartets played Mozart in alcoves filled with priceless artwork donated for the evening's auction. Elena moved through the crowd like a dancer, invisible but essential, coordinating with caterers, smoothing over seating disputes, ensuring that everything flowed seamlessly. She wore a simple black dress borrowed from her roommate, her only jewelry a pair of pearl earrings her grandmother had given her before she died. In a room full of women wearing million-dollar gowns, Elena's understated elegance made her stand out like a single candle in a room full of spotlights. That's when she saw him. Adrian Kane at 31 was already a legend in Manhattan's business world, the man who had inherited his father's small construction company and transformed it into Kane International, a billion-dollar empire that built skyscrapers in 12 countries. 6 feet 2 inches of controlled power in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, storm-gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, calculating profit and loss in every glance. Elena had read about him in business magazines, seen his picture in society columns, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming presence of Adrian Kane in person. He moved through the crowd like a predator, people stepping aside without even realizing they were doing so, conversations pausing as he passed. This was a man who had never heard the word no, who bent reality to his will through sheer force of determination. She was carrying a tray of champagne glasses to the auction area when it happened. Someone bumped into her from behind, and Elena stumbled forward, the tray tilting at exactly the wrong angle. Time seemed to slow as she watched 12 glasses of Dom Perignon 1996 cascade through the air like liquid diamonds, landing with perfect accuracy across the front of Adrian Kane's $50,000 Armani tuxedo. The silence that followed was deafening. 500 of New York's most powerful people turned to stare at the girl from Queens, who had just baptized their most feared businessman in vintage champagne. Elena felt her cheeks burn with mortification as she grabbed napkins from a nearby table, her apologies tumbling out in a breathless stream. "I am so sorry, Mr. Kane. I am so incredibly sorry. Let me help you. I can pay for the dry cleaning. I can." Her voice trailed off as she realized she was essentially offering to pay for something that cost more than she earned in 6 months. But instead of the explosion of anger she expected, instead of the cold dismissal that would have been perfectly justified, Adrian Kane began to laugh. Not the polite chuckle of someone trying to make the best of an awkward situation, but genuine, surprised laughter that transformed his entire face. "Most people are afraid to even breathe near me," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that Elena hadn't expected. "You've just baptized me in Bordeaux. I have to admit, that's a first." He was looking at her now, really looking, and Elena felt something shift in the air between them. This wasn't the calculating businessman from the magazine covers. This was someone younger, more vulnerable, surprised by his own reaction to a beautiful woman who had just ruined his evening wear. "It's actually Dom Perignon," Elena said quietly, then immediately regretted correcting him. "Not that it matters. I mean, expensive champagne is expensive champagne when it's all over your tuxedo." "Dom Perignon," he repeated, and there was something in his voice that made Elena look up from her frantic napkin dabbing. "You know wine." "I know event planning," she replied. "Wine is just part of the job description." That night, after Elena had successfully orchestrated an auction that raised $2.3 million for children's literacy programs, she found a note waiting for her at the coat check. Heavy cream paper with a simple message written in Adrian's bold handwriting. "Dinner tomorrow? I promise to wear something less expensive. Adrian Kane." Below it, his private number. Elena stared at that note for a long time. She understood that accepting meant stepping into a world where she didn't belong, a world where one wrong move could destroy her carefully built reputation. But she also understood that some opportunities only come once in a lifetime, and some people enter your life like shooting stars, burning bright and beautiful and impossible to ignore. She called him the next morning, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. When his voice answered, warm and amused, she made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Kane? This is Elena Marquez, your champagne baptizer. About that dinner invitation." What followed was the most intense courtship Manhattan had seen in decades. Adrian Kane, a man who had never pursued anything he couldn't calculate and control, found himself completely captivated by a woman who existed outside every equation he understood. He sent her flowers every morning, not the expected roses but exotic orchids that matched her eyes, birds of paradise that reflected her grace, jasmine that reminded him of how she made ordinary moments feel magical. He took her to restaurants where reservations were booked months in advance, where the sommelier knew his preferences and the chef created special dishes that existed nowhere on any menu. But Elena's favorite moments were the quiet ones in his penthouse, when Adrian would cook for her himself, his sleeves rolled up as he prepared simple pasta dishes while she sat on his kitchen counter, her bare feet swinging, watching this powerful man reveal parts of himself he showed to no one else. "I don't belong in your world," Elena told him one evening as they stood on his balcony, the lights of Manhattan spread out below them like fallen stars. She was wearing one of his shirts, her dark hair flowing over the white cotton, and Adrian thought he had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. "Maybe my world needs someone like you," he replied, and in that moment, Elena understood that Adrian Kane wasn't just falling in love with her. He was falling in love with the version of himself he became when he was with her. Someone gentler, more human, capable of laughter and spontaneity, and all the things that money couldn't buy. Their first kiss happened on that balcony, with the city as their witness and eternity spreading out before them like a promise. Elena had been kissed before, but never like this, never with the intensity of someone who had built empires but never learned how to build love. When Adrian's lips met hers, she understood that some forces of nature cannot be resisted, only surrendered to. The media discovered them within weeks. Billionaire's mystery woman screamed the headlines, accompanied by grainy photographs of Elena leaving his building, sitting beside him at charity functions, dancing with him at galas where she was no longer the coordinator but the guest of honor. Manhattan society pages dissected every outfit she wore, every expression on her face, trying to understand how a girl from Queens had captured the heart of one of the world's most eligible bachelors. But Elena and Adrian existed in a bubble that gossip columns couldn't penetrate. In private, away from cameras and speculation, they built something that felt unshakable. Adrian showed Elena parts of Manhattan she had never seen, took her to his private club where old men with older money played cards and discussed the fate of nations. Elena introduced Adrian to her world, brought him to Queens to meet her parents, watched him sit in their tiny kitchen eating her mother's homemade empanadas like they were the finest delicacies he had ever tasted. Maria Marquez studied this billionaire who loved her daughter, searching his storm-gray eyes for signs of the cruelty that often accompanied such wealth. But she saw something that surprised her. Loneliness. Despite everything he owned, every door that opened at his approach, Adrian Kane was fundamentally alone in the world. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 25, just as his company was beginning its meteoric rise. He had no siblings, no close friends who weren't somehow connected to his business empire. Elena wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his family, his anchor, his connection to a world where love mattered more than profit margins. The proposal happened exactly 1 year after their first meeting, in the same spot where Elena had spilled champagne on his tuxedo. Adrian had arranged for the Met to be closed to the public, had filled the grand hall with thousands of white roses and hundreds of candles. When Elena walked in wearing the same simple black dress from that first night, she found Adrian waiting for her in the exact spot where their story began. "A year ago, you ruined my tuxedo," he said, dropping to one knee with a ring that caught the candlelight like a captured star. "Today, I want you to ruin my life in the most beautiful way possible. Elena Marquez, will you marry me?" She said yes through tears that felt like diamonds on her cheeks, and Adrian slipped a 10-carat solitaire onto her finger while photographers hidden in the balconies captured every moment for posterity. But what the photographs couldn't capture was the way Elena's yes felt like coming home to a place Adrian had never known existed. The wedding planning consumed the next 8 months, transforming from Elena's dream into Manhattan's event of the decade. The Plaza Hotel, the same venue where Adrian would later plan his revenge, became the stage for a love story that seemed destined for fairy tale endings. $2.8 million spent on a single day, creating a celebration that would be talked about for years. 800 guests filled the grand ballroom, everyone who mattered in New York and beyond. Celebrities whose movies Elena had watched growing up, politicians whose decisions shaped the world, business moguls whose empires rivaled Adrian's own. But Elena saw none of them as she walked down the aisle in her Vera Wang gown, hand-beaded silk with a 20-foot train that flowed behind her like liquid moonlight. She saw only Adrian, standing at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and for the first time since she had known him, she watched tears flow down his face. Not the careful emotion of a man conscious of his image, but raw, overwhelming joy at the sight of the woman who had changed everything, walking toward him surrounded by 10,000 white roses. Their vows were simple but profound. "Adrian promised to protect and cherish the only woman who sees my soul, while Elena vowed to love you through every storm." Words that would echo through everything that followed, promises that would be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. The reception was a blur of champagne toasts and dancing, of congratulations from people Elena barely knew but who claimed to have always believed in their love. But the moment she would remember forever was their first dance as husband and wife, swaying to Etta James while the rest of the world faded away. In Adrian's arms, surrounded by the opulence of Manhattan's elite but focused only on each other, Elena felt like the luckiest woman who had ever lived. Their honeymoon was 3 weeks in the Greek islands, staying at Adrian's private villa on Santorini where they could forget that the outside world existed. Elena painted watercolors of the sunset while Adrian worked on his laptop, but even business calls couldn't completely capture his attention when his wife was walking around in flowing sundresses, her hair loose and her skin golden from the Mediterranean sun. They talked about everything during those lazy afternoons. Adrian's dreams of expanding Kane International into renewable energy, Elena's hope of starting a foundation that would provide art education to underprivileged children. They planned the children they would have, the family that would fill the empty spaces in Adrian's enormous penthouse. 5 kids, they decided, enough to create the chaos and laughter that Adrian had never experienced but suddenly craved more than his next billion-dollar deal. Returning to Manhattan, Elena settled into her new role as Mrs. Adrian Kane with the same grace that had made her such a successful event planner. The $40 million penthouse with its panoramic views of Central Park became her canvas, and she transformed it from a sterile showcase of wealth into something that actually felt like a home. Warm colors replaced Adrian's minimalist black and white palette, fresh flowers appeared in every room, and the kitchen became a place where they cooked together rather than simply displaying the services of their private chef. Elena kept her charity work, but now she could do more than simply coordinate events. The Kane Foundation became her passion project, funding art programs in schools across the 5 boroughs, providing scholarships for talented students who reminded Elena of herself at 18. Adrian would sometimes surprise her by appearing at these events, watching with pride as his wife transformed lives with the same skill she had once used to arrange flowers and coordinate auctions. Their staff of 15 treated Elena with the respect due to their employer's wife, but also with a genuine affection earned by someone who remembered their names, asked about their families, and made them feel like valued members of a household rather than invisible servants. Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeper who had worked for Adrian for 8 years, would later say that the penthouse had never felt like a home until Elena moved in. Private moments became Elena's treasures. Sunday mornings when Adrian would make coffee and they would read the newspapers in bed, his arm around her shoulders as she commented on articles about people they had met at various galas. Evenings when he would teach her to drive his Lamborghini through the winding roads of the Hamptons, his hands covering hers on the steering wheel as she learned to handle $300,000 worth of Italian engineering. Weekend escapes to his private island in the Bahamas, where they could swim naked in their private lagoon and make love on beaches where no paparazzi could intrude. Elena would paint while Adrian worked, but increasingly, she would look up from her easel to find him watching her instead of his laptop screen, his storm-gray eyes soft with contentment. For 18 months, their marriage was everything Elena had dreamed it could be. They were Manhattan's golden couple, photographed at every important social event, their love story becoming the template that other wealthy couples aspired to emulate. Elena never quite got used to the attention, but she learned to navigate it with Adrian's guidance, understanding that their public appearances were part of the price they paid for the private happiness they had built together. Then Elena discovered she was pregnant. The morning sickness hit her during a board meeting for the Kane Foundation, a wave of nausea so sudden and overwhelming that she barely made it to the private bathroom before she was violently sick. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, perhaps the sushi from the previous night's dinner party. But when the nausea continued for 3 days, accompanied by exhaustion that no amount of coffee could cure, Elena began to suspect something that filled her with equal parts terror and joy. The pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines that changed everything. Elena stared at those lines for a full 5 minutes, her hand shaking as she contemplated the magnitude of what they meant. She was going to be a mother. Adrian was going to be a father. The empty bedrooms in their penthouse would finally be filled with the laughter they had dreamed about during those lazy afternoons in Santorini. But how do you tell a man who controls billion-dollar acquisitions that he's about to face something that can't be managed or calculated? How do you tell someone who has never known family that he's about to become one? Elena chose the library where Adrian spent his evenings reviewing contracts, the room lined with first-edition books and dominated by the desk where he had built his empire. She found him there that night, reading quarterly reports with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. For a moment, she just watched him, memorizing the way the lamplight cast shadows across his strong features, knowing that this moment would divide their life into before and after. "Adrian," she said softly, and he looked up with a smile he reserved only for her. "I need to tell you something." Something in her voice made him put down his papers, his full attention focused on his wife standing in the doorway in her silk pajamas, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge they both had to decide whether to cross. Elena watched Adrian's face cycle through surprise, disbelief, calculation, and finally, overwhelming joy. When he stood up from his desk, his movements were careful, deliberate, as if sudden motion might shatter the miracle she had just announced. "Pregnant," he repeated, the word foreign on his tongue. "You're sure?" Elena pulled the pregnancy test from her pocket, holding it out like evidence in a case she desperately wanted him to rule in favor of. Adrian took it with hands that trembled slightly, studying those 2 pink lines as if they were the most important contract he had ever reviewed. Then he looked up at her, and Elena saw tears streaming down his face. "A little prince or princess," he whispered, and Elena knew that everything was going to be perfect. The next 6 weeks were the happiest of Elena's life. Adrian threw himself into pregnancy preparation with the same intensity he brought to hostile takeovers. Their guest bedroom became a nursery planning center, filled with color swatches and furniture catalogs and books about child development that Adrian read like military strategy guides. They spent evenings choosing names, Adrian's hand resting on Elena's still flat belly as they debated whether Alexander Adrian Kane or Sophia Elena Kane sounded more distinguished. Adrian's protective instincts kicked into overdrive. Elena's morning sickness became a reason to hire the city's best nutritionist. Her fatigue prompted him to cancel evening social events so she could rest. When she mentioned craving pickles and ice cream at 3 in the morning, Adrian personally drove to an all-night deli to satisfy her request, returning with enough groceries to stock a small restaurant. "You don't have to take care of me like I'm made of glass," Elena protested as Adrian helped her out of the car after a routine doctor's appointment. "You're carrying my child," he replied, his voice fierce with protectiveness. "Taking care of you is the most important job I've ever had." Elena fell in love with him all over again during those weeks. This softer version of Adrian, the man who read pregnancy books and talked to her belly and cried when they heard the baby's heartbeat for the first time. She began to understand that becoming a father wasn't just something Adrian wanted. It was something he needed, the missing piece that would finally make his empire feel like home. But fairy tales, as Elena was about to learn, don't prepare you for the moments when dreams become nightmares without warning. The miscarriage happened during a business dinner at Le Bernardin, 12 weeks into the pregnancy that had transformed their marriage into everything Elena had ever wanted it to be. She was discussing the Kane Foundation's new scholarship program with the wife of one of Adrian's potential partners when the cramping started, sharp and sudden and wrong in every possible way. Elena excused herself to the restroom, her heart pounding as she recognized what her body was telling her. The bleeding started before she reached the door, and she knew with devastating certainty that the future they had planned, the child they had already loved, the names they had chosen and the nursery they had begun to design, all of it was ending in a restaurant bathroom while Adrian sat 30 feet away discussing profit margins. The hospital confirmed what Elena already knew. Their baby was gone, lost to one of those cruel biological accidents that no amount of money or love or desperate prayer can prevent. Elena lay in the sterile hospital bed, Adrian's hand gripping hers, both of them staring at the ultrasound screen that showed nothing where their child's heartbeat had been just days before. "I'm sorry," the doctor said, her voice professionally gentle. "Sometimes these things just happen. There's nothing you could have done differently." But Elena heard something else in those words. Failure. Inadequacy. The inability to perform the most basic function that women had been fulfilling since the beginning of time. She had disappointed Adrian in the most fundamental way possible, proven herself incapable of giving him the one thing his money couldn't buy. Adrian was devastated, but his grief manifested as furious activity. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, staying at the office until midnight, traveling constantly for deals that could have been handled by subordinates. When he was home, he moved through their penthouse like a ghost, unable to meet Elena's eyes, unable to talk about what they had lost. Elena understood his coping mechanism because she had seen it before, the way Adrian dealt with problems by focusing on things he could control. But understanding didn't make his emotional absence less devastating. She needed him to grieve with her, to acknowledge that they had lost something precious together, to hold her while she cried for the child who would never paint with her or learn business strategies from him. Instead, she got silence. Polite, careful distance from the man who had promised to love her through every storm. Adrian still came to bed every night, still kissed her goodbye every morning, still attended the social events that their status required. But he was absent in every way that mattered, unreachable behind walls of work and determination, and the kind of emotional shutdown that Elena had never seen before. The miscarriage changed them both, but in opposite directions. Elena needed to talk, to cry, to process the loss until it became something she could carry without it destroying her. Adrian needed to forget, to move forward, to treat the pregnancy like a failed business venture that could be written off and replaced with the next opportunity. Neither approach worked, and slowly, the marriage that had seemed unshakable began to develop cracks that would eventually become chasms. Elena spent her days in their penthouse, unable to summon energy for the charity work that had once brought her such fulfillment. She would stand at the window overlooking Central Park, watching other people's children play on swings and slides, feeling like she was observing life through bulletproof glass. The nursery door stayed closed, but Elena knew the room was still there, waiting for a child who would never come home. Adrian buried himself deeper in Kane International's expansion, pursuing deals and markets he had never previously considered, working 18-hour days that ended with him falling into bed exhausted and unreachable. When Elena tried to talk about the miscarriage, about the grief counseling the doctor had recommended, about the possibility of trying again, Adrian would find urgent business calls that required his immediate attention. For 3 months, they lived like polite strangers who happened to share an address. Elena began to understand that money could buy many things, but it couldn't buy emotional courage. It couldn't force someone to face grief instead of running from it. And it couldn't bridge the gap between two people who were drowning in the same loss but couldn't reach each other through the darkness. Then Victoria Sterling walked into their lives like a beautifully dressed harbinger of destruction. Adrian's introduction of his new business partner happened at a cocktail party in their own penthouse, Elena playing hostess to 60 of Manhattan's most influential investors while Adrian presented his latest acquisition. Victoria Sterling was everything Elena wasn't. Tall where Elena was petite, blonde where Elena was brunette, sharp where Elena was soft. At 29, she had built a reputation in London's financial district that preceded her arrival in New York, known for her brilliance, her ruthlessness, and her ability to identify opportunities that other people missed. "Elena, I'd like you to meet Victoria Sterling," Adrian said, his hand on the small of Elena's back as he made the introduction. "Victoria will be heading up our European expansion." Victoria's handshake was firm, her smile perfect, her assessment of Elena swift and comprehensive. In those first few seconds, Elena felt like she was being catalogued, her strengths and weaknesses noted and filed away for future reference. But Victoria's manner was charming, warm, interested in Elena's charity work and sympathetic about the miscarriage that had become public knowledge through Manhattan's gossip network. "I lost a baby myself a few years ago," Victoria confided over champagne, her voice low and empathetic. "People think you should just get over it and try again, but they don't understand how it changes you." Elena felt a rush of gratitude toward this beautiful stranger who understood what Adrian couldn't seem to grasp. Finally, someone who recognized that grief couldn't be managed like a business problem, someone who acknowledged that some losses leave permanent scars. Over the following weeks, Victoria became Elena's closest friend, the sister she had never had and the confidant she desperately needed. They met for lunch at exclusive restaurants where Victoria would listen to Elena's fears about her marriage, her guilt about the miscarriage, her growing sense that she was failing Adrian in ways she didn't understand. Victoria was the perfect friend, offering sympathy without judgment, advice without condescension, understanding that felt like salvation to Elena's wounded spirit. She never suggested that Elena was overreacting to Adrian's emotional distance. She never minimized the pain of losing a child. Instead, she validated every fear, confirmed every suspicion, and slowly, carefully, began to plant seeds of doubt about Adrian's true feelings. "Men like Adrian," Victoria would say over their weekly spa appointments, "they're not equipped to handle emotional complexity. They see everything in terms of success and failure, and when something doesn't go according to plan, they look for someone to blame." Elena didn't want to believe that Adrian blamed her for the miscarriage, but Victoria's words echoed her own deepest fears. Why else would he withdraw from her so completely? Why else would he find excuses to avoid intimacy, to stay late at the office, to schedule business trips that kept him away for weeks at a time? What Elena didn't see were the private meetings between Adrian and Victoria, the way their professional relationship was evolving into something more dangerous. Victoria was brilliant at her job, bringing Kane international deals that would add hundreds of millions to the company's value. But she was even more brilliant at reading people, at understanding exactly what they needed and becoming that thing. Adrian needed someone who could match his intensity, who understood the pressures of building and maintaining an empire, who didn't require emotional availability he wasn't capable of providing in his grief-stricken state. Victoria became that person, staying late to discuss strategy, offering insights that proved her worth, providing the intellectual stimulation and professional partnership that Elena couldn't supply. She never made the first move. Victoria Sterling was too intelligent to risk her position with anything as crude as obvious seduction. Instead, she let Adrian come to her, let him seek out her company because she made him feel competent and powerful and emotionally uncomplicated. When he worked with Victoria, he didn't have to think about ultrasound screens that showed nothing or wives who cried when they thought he wasn't looking. The first kiss happened in Adrian's office at 2 a.m, after they had successfully closed a deal that would establish Kane International as a major player in renewable energy. Victoria had brought champagne to celebrate, and when Adrian leaned across his desk to clink glasses, she moved just slightly closer, her lips meeting his in what seemed like a spontaneous moment of shared triumph. But nothing Victoria Sterling did was ever spontaneous. She had been maneuvering toward this moment for months, positioning herself as indispensable to Adrian's business and irreplaceable in his personal life. The grieving husband who couldn't comfort his wife found solace in the brilliant woman who needed nothing from him except his body and his mind. What followed was an affair that existed in the shadows between their professional relationship, stolen moments in hotel rooms during business trips, late-night encounters in Adrian's office after the cleaning crew had gone home. Victoria never asked for more than Adrian was willing to give, never pressured him to leave Elena, never created drama that might jeopardize her carefully constructed position. She was patient, calculating, playing a game that Elena didn't even know existed while positioning herself to claim everything Elena held dear. But Victoria's ultimate plan required more than seduction. It required Elena's complete destruction, her exile from the world she had come to love, her transformation from beloved wife to scorned pariah. And for that, Victoria would need to convince Adrian that Elena had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. The frame-up began with small things. Questions about Elena's whereabouts, doubts about her loyalty, suggestions that grief might drive someone to desperate actions. Victoria had studied Elena's schedule, her habits, her vulnerabilities, looking for the perfect opportunity to destroy her rival once and for all. As Elena grieved in isolation, Victoria began weaving her web with the patience of a spider and the cunning of a serpent. She had one goal: to claim Adrian Kane's empire and destroy anyone who stood in her way. But Elena had no idea that her greatest enemy was masquerading as her closest friend, or that every confidence she shared was being weaponized against her. The foundation for Elena's destruction was being laid one conversation at a time, one seed of doubt planted carefully in Adrian's mind, one piece of fabricated evidence prepared to prove that the woman he had once loved above all things was nothing more than a beautiful lie. And in the penthouse overlooking Central Park, Elena Marquez Kane continued to trust the woman who was orchestrating her downfall, believing that Victoria Sterling was the only person in Manhattan who truly understood her pain. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be your worst enemy? Sometimes the people who offer us comfort in our darkest moments are the ones who pushed us into the darkness to begin with, and recognizing those warning signs can save us from betrayals that destroy everything we hold dear. Victoria Kane had always been a master of masks. Behind her perfectly sculpted smile and designer wardrobe lay the calculating mind of a predator who had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation. As Elena struggled through the darkest period of her grief, Victoria saw not a woman in pain, but an opportunity wrapped in vulnerability. The first strike came disguised as friendship. Victoria appeared at Elena's doorstep on a Tuesday morning, her arms filled with fresh orchids and her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "I know how difficult things must be for you right now," she said, her manicured hand resting gently on Elena's shoulder. "I lost my mother when I was young too. Sometimes we need someone who truly understands." Elena, desperate for any connection in her world of isolation, welcomed Victoria with the gratitude of a drowning woman grasping at a lifeline. She had no way of knowing she was inviting the architect of her own destruction into her home. Over the following weeks, Victoria wove herself seamlessly into Elena's daily routine. Lunch dates at exclusive Manhattan restaurants became a regular occurrence, where Victoria would listen with feigned empathy as Elena poured out her heart about the distance growing between her and Adrian. The spa days that followed were carefully orchestrated therapy sessions where Victoria played the role of confidant while mentally cataloging every weakness, every insecurity, every crack in Elena's armor. "You look exhausted, darling," Victoria would say, her voice honeyed with false concern as they sat side by side in the marble-lined steam room. "When was the last time Adrian really looked at you? I mean, really saw you?" The poison was delivered so subtly, so wrapped in apparent care, that Elena felt grateful for Victoria's honesty rather than wounded by her words. During their shopping expeditions along Fifth Avenue, Victoria's strategy became even more insidious. She would hold up a stunning dress against Elena's frame and shake her head with theatrical sadness. "You have such a beautiful figure, but grief has changed you. Adrian must miss the woman he married." Each comment was a tiny blade, cutting away at Elena's already fragile self-esteem while Victoria presented herself as the caring friend brave enough to speak difficult truths. Elena found herself confessing things to Victoria that she had never spoken aloud, not even to Adrian. The way she felt invisible in her own home. The nights she lay awake wondering if her husband still loved her. The fear that her mother's death had fundamentally broken something inside her that could never be repaired. Victoria absorbed every revelation like a sponge, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction behind her mask of sympathy. "Marriage is so complicated," Victoria would murmur, reaching across the table to squeeze Elena's hand. "Sometimes I think men simply aren't equipped to handle a woman's deeper emotions. They want the beautiful, carefree version of us, not the real person with real pain." It was psychological warfare disguised as girl talk, and Elena walked into every trap with the blind trust of someone who had forgotten that not all predators hunt with claws and fangs. Meanwhile, Victoria had begun phase 2 of her elaborate scheme. Adrian's late nights at the office, which had become increasingly frequent as he threw himself into work to avoid confronting his failing marriage, provided the perfect hunting ground. Victoria positioned herself as the ideal confidant and collaborator, always available for those crucial late-night strategy sessions that seemed to drag on until the early hours of morning. She studied Adrian with the same meticulous attention she had given Elena, but her approach was entirely different. Where Elena needed comfort and validation, Adrian craved admiration and intellectual stimulation. Victoria provided both in carefully measured doses, presenting herself as a woman who understood the pressures of his world in ways his grief-stricken wife simply couldn't. "The Morrison deal is falling apart," Adrian confided one evening as they worked alone in his corner office, the city lights twinkling like fallen stars beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Victoria moved closer, ostensibly to examine the documents spread across his desk, but close enough that he could smell her subtle perfume and feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "You're carrying the weight of everything," she said softly, her voice filled with an understanding that Elena's had lost months ago. "Your company, your employees, your family. Sometimes I wonder if anyone realizes the impossible burden you shoulder every single day." It was exactly what Adrian needed to hear, delivered by a woman whose confidence and composure stood in stark contrast to his wife's emotional fragility. Victoria's seduction was a masterpiece of timing and psychology. She never pushed, never demanded, never appeared desperate or needy. Instead, she created moments of intimacy so natural they seemed to happen by accident. A hand on his shoulder when he looked particularly stressed. Eyes that lingered just a beat too long when he spoke about his frustrations. Conversations that somehow always steered toward the ways she admired his strength and vision. The night she made her decisive move, Adrian had just received news that a major acquisition had fallen through at the last minute, costing Kane International millions in potential revenue. He sat slumped in his leather chair, his usually perfect composure cracked with exhaustion and disappointment. Victoria found him there after midnight, still staring at the failure reports scattered across his desk. "I brought you some coffee," she said quietly, setting a steaming mug beside his elbow. "I know you won't go home until you've figured out how to fix this." The simple gesture, so different from Elena's tendency to retreat when he was stressed, touched something in Adrian that had been dormant for months. "Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting this battle completely alone," he admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. Victoria moved behind his chair, her hand settling on his tense shoulders with gentle pressure. "You're not alone," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "You have people who believe in you, who see your brilliance even when you can't see it yourself." When he turned in his chair to look at her, Victoria was there, her face inches from his, her eyes reflecting a mixture of desire and understanding that he hadn't seen in anyone's gaze for far too long. The kiss happened like a spark igniting dry kindling. Adrian's hands found her waist as she leaned down to meet him, months of loneliness and frustration pouring into that single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Victoria rested her forehead against his with a smile that seemed to hold all the comfort and acceptance he had been craving. "This stays between us," he said quietly, but his hands remained on her waist, betraying his true feelings. "Of course," Victoria replied, though her smile widened with triumph he was too intoxicated to notice. "I would never want to complicate your life. I care about you too much to watch you suffer in silence." From that moment forward, their relationship became a carefully orchestrated dance of secrecy and desire. Victoria booked a suite at the plaza under an assumed name, transforming it into their private sanctuary where Adrian could escape from the suffocating grief that permeated his home. While Elena attended her weekly therapy sessions, trying desperately to claw her way back to emotional stability, Adrian found himself counting the hours until he could lose himself in Victoria's arms and her intoxicating confidence. Victoria was everything Elena had temporarily ceased to be. She was vibrant where Elena was subdued, passionate where Elena was withdrawn, endlessly fascinated by Adrian's business triumphs where Elena seemed too lost in her own pain to celebrate his successes. In bed, Victoria worshipped Adrian's body with an enthusiasm that made him feel powerful and desired rather than like a burden his wife could barely tolerate. "Elena doesn't understand the pressures you face," Victoria would murmur against his chest as they lay tangled in silk sheets, the afternoon sun filtering through the hotel's heavy curtains. "She's so consumed by her own grief that she's forgotten you lost someone too. You lost your mother-in-law, and then you lost your wife to sorrow." The words were poison disguised as insight, but Adrian drank them eagerly. Victoria had identified his deepest resentment and given him permission to feel it fully. Yes, he had been patient with Elena's grief. Yes, he had tried to be understanding and supportive. But where was his support? When had Elena last asked about his struggles or celebrated his victories or simply held him without the weight of her sadness pressing between them? Adrian began to justify the affair with frightening ease. She's been gone emotionally for months, he told himself as he canceled dinner plans with Elena to meet Victoria instead. I'm not betraying my wife because the woman I married disappeared the day her mother died. It was a convenient lie that allowed him to indulge in his passion for Victoria without confronting the magnitude of his betrayal. Victoria, meanwhile, was playing a much longer game than simple seduction. During their intimate conversations, she began planting seeds of doubt about Elena's character and motivations. I worry about her, she would say with practiced concern. All that anger and resentment she's carrying. People in that much pain sometimes lash out in unpredictable ways. The suggestions were subtle but persistent, designed to erode Adrian's trust in his wife from the inside out. She also began her intelligence-gathering operation in earnest. Victoria had learned long ago that information was the ultimate weapon, and she systematically began to map every aspect of Elena's life. The household staff, already uncomfortable with the tension between their employers, proved surprisingly easy to turn. A generous tip here, a sympathetic ear there, and suddenly Victoria knew Elena's daily schedule, her therapy appointments, her phone conversations, even the contents of her private correspondence. Maria, the housekeeper who had served the Canes faithfully for over a decade, found herself in Victoria's debt after her grandson's medical emergency. Victoria's generous loan came with an implicit expectation of loyalty that Maria was too grateful and too frightened to refuse. Soon Victoria knew about every visitor Elena received, every call she made, every tear she shed when she thought no one was watching. Elena, meanwhile, existed in a haze of confusion and growing paranoia. She sensed something had shifted in her marriage, but couldn't identify what had changed. Adrian seemed more distant than ever, but also strangely energized by something she couldn't name. He worked later and traveled more frequently, always with reasonable explanations that she couldn't quite bring herself to believe. You seem happier lately, she ventured one evening as they sat at opposite ends of their dining room table, the space between them feeling vast as an ocean. Adrian looked up from his phone, where he had been texting Victoria, and gave Elena a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just relieved to have some major deals finally closing, he replied smoothly. The Morrison acquisition might still be salvageable. Elena nodded and returned to picking at her meal, but something in his tone made her stomach twist with unease. She began to notice little things that hadn't been there before. New cologne that wasn't his usual scent. Unexplained charges on credit card statements that he dismissed as business expenses. Most troubling of all, his phone had developed a password lock that he claimed was for security purposes, but that coincided perfectly with his emotional withdrawal from their marriage. But whenever Elena tried to voice her concerns, Victoria was there with a reasonable explanation and gentle discouragement. Adrian's under enormous pressure right now, she would say during their weekly lunch dates. The last thing he needs is to feel like you don't trust him. Men can sense suspicion, and it makes them withdraw even more. Elena found herself apologizing for doubts she couldn't shake and suspicions she couldn't prove. Victoria had positioned herself as the voice of reason and matrimonial wisdom, always steering Elena away from confrontation and toward patience. It was a masterful manipulation that kept Elena paralyzed with uncertainty, while Victoria consolidated her hold over Adrian's heart and mind. The trap Victoria had spent months constructing was finally ready to spring. But this wouldn't be a simple matter of exposing an affair or breaking up a marriage. Victoria's ambitions were far grander and infinitely more cruel. She intended to destroy Elena so thoroughly that Adrian would have no choice but to turn to her completely, and she intended to do it in a way that would leave Elena with no recourse and no hope of redemption. Corporate espionage was a serious crime in Adrian's world, punishable not just by financial ruin but by complete social and professional exile. Victoria had researched the legal implications meticulously, understanding exactly how to construct a case that would be impossible for Elena to disprove and devastating in its consequences. The beauty of her plan lay in its simplicity and believability. Elena, consumed by grief and resentment, finally snapping and deciding to hurt Adrian in the most damaging way possible by selling his secrets to competitors. Marcus Reed, the CEO of Blackstone Industries, was Kane International's primary rival and exactly the kind of ruthless businessman who would hypothetically pay handsomely for inside information about Adrian's upcoming mergers and acquisitions. Victoria had studied Reed carefully, understanding his business practices and personal history well enough to make her fabricated connection between him and Elena seem entirely plausible. The The photoshopped images were works of art in their own right. Victoria hired a discreet digital artist who specialized in creating evidence for wealthy clients' divorce proceedings, paying him triple his usual rate for absolute silence and perfection. The photos showed Elena in what appeared to be intimate conversation with Reed at various high-end Manhattan restaurants, their body language suggesting conspiracy and familiarity that would be impossible to explain away innocently. But photographs alone wouldn't be enough. Victoria needed financial evidence that would demonstrate clear motive and payment for Elena's theoretical betrayal. The forged bank documents were perhaps the most challenging aspect of her plan, requiring her to establish a series of shell companies and false identities that could theoretically funnel money from Blackstone Industries to Elena's personal accounts. The timing had to be perfect. Elena's therapy sessions provided a regular window of opportunity, but Victoria needed to ensure that her discovery of the evidence would seem accidental and heartbreaking rather than suspicious. She spent weeks rehearsing her emotional response, practicing the perfect combination of shock, devastation, and reluctant loyalty that would make Adrian believe she was genuinely torn between protecting him and protecting his wife. On the morning Victoria chose to spring her trap, Elena left for her therapy appointment with Dr. Sarah Chun, as she did every Thursday at 10 o'clock. Victoria waited 30 minutes to ensure Elena wouldn't return unexpectedly, then let herself into the Kane mansion using the key Maria had provided. She moved through Elena's study like a ghost, planting the forged documents in places where they would be discovered during a thorough search, but not so obviously that their placement would seem artificial. The final touch was the most personal and cruel. Victoria planted a piece of jewelry that Reed had been photographed wearing at public events, a distinctive platinum cufflink that would later be found in Elena's jewelry box as proof of their intimate connection. It was a detail that would cut Adrian to the bone and eliminate any possibility that Elena's relationship with Reed was purely professional. When Victoria called Adrian that afternoon, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion, she delivered her performance flawlessly. "I need to see you immediately," she whispered into the phone, her words broken by what sounded like genuine sobs. "It's about Elena. I found something. Adrian, I don't know how to tell you this." Adrian arrived at Victoria's apartment within 20 minutes, his face tight with concern and growing dread. Victoria met him at the door with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, the very picture of a woman who had stumbled upon a truth that shattered her faith in human nature. She led him to her dining room table, where she had spread out copies of all the fabricated evidence like pieces of a devastating puzzle. "I didn't want to believe it," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I first noticed the phone calls and the secretive behavior, I told myself I was being paranoid. Elena's your wife. She loves you. But then I saw her with him at Bergamot last Tuesday, and something in their body language." Victoria's voice broke artistically, and she covered her face with her hands. Adrian stared at the photographs with the expression of a man watching his world crumble in real time. The images were undeniable in their clarity and damning in their implications. Elena, looking animated and engaged in ways she hadn't with him in months, leaning across restaurant tables toward a man Adrian recognized as his most dangerous business rival. "Maybe there's an innocent explanation," he said weakly, but even as the words left his mouth, he was studying the financial documents that told an even more devastating story. Payments totaling nearly $2 million, transferred to Elena's personal account in increments that corresponded perfectly with dates when Adrian had shared sensitive business information with her. Victoria moved closer, her hand finding his shoulder with gentle pressure. "I've been watching her, trying to convince myself I was wrong. But Adrian, she's been photographing documents from your study. I have proof of that too." She produced additional images showing Elena's hands on papers that Adrian recognized as confidential merger documents, the timestamp clearly indicating when Adrian had been out of town on business. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously crafted to exploit Adrian's deepest fears about his marriage. Here was proof that Elena's emotional withdrawal hadn't been about grief at all, but about guilt over her systematic betrayal of his trust. The woman he had worried about and made excuses for had been methodically destroying him from the inside while he agonized over how to help her heal. "I should confront her," Adrian said, his voice hollow with shock and growing rage. "You should," Victoria agreed, though her tone suggested she thought Elena would simply lie her way out of the accusations. "But Adrian, please be careful. Someone capable of this level of deception and betrayal, you don't know what else she might be planning." The confrontation that followed would haunt both Adrian and Elena for years to come. Adrian waited until Elena returned from her therapy session, his rage building with every passing hour as he studied Victoria's evidence and imagined how long his wife had been playing him for a fool. When Elena entered their bedroom that evening, tired from another emotionally draining session with Dr. Chun, she found Adrian seated in the chair by their window with a manila folder in his lap and an expression she had never seen before. "Sit down," he said quietly, his voice carrying a coldness that made Elena's blood freeze in her veins. "We need to talk." Elena perched on the edge of their bed, her hands clasped in her lap, sensing that whatever was about to happen would change everything between them forever. Adrian opened the folder and began laying out photographs like cards in a poker game, each image hitting Elena with a force of physical blows. "Care to explain these?" Adrian's voice was deadly calm, the tone he used with business rivals he was about to destroy. Elena stared at the images in complete bewilderment, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "I don't understand," she whispered, reaching for one of the photographs. "Adrian, this isn't. I've never met this man in my life." "Really?" Adrian's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Because you seem quite comfortable with Marcus Reed. Comfortable enough to share intimate dinners with him. Comfortable enough to sell him my business secrets for $2 million. The bank statements he produced next made Elena's knees go weak. Her name, her account numbers, deposits she had never made and never authorized. The numbers swam before her eyes as the magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. "Someone has done this to frame me," she said desperately, her voice rising with panic. "Adrian, you have to know I would never betray you. Never. Someone has manufactured this evidence to destroy our marriage." "Who, Elena?" Adrian's voice was like ice. "Who would go to this much trouble? Who would have access to your personal information and mine? Who would hate us enough to orchestrate something this elaborate?" His questions hung in the air like accusations because they both knew Elena had no answers. Elena's mind raced desperately through possibilities, but every explanation sounded absurd even to her own ears. As she stared at the photographic evidence of meetings she had never attended and financial transactions she had never made, a terrible realization began to crystallize in her consciousness. "Victoria," she breathed, the name escaping her lips like a prayer and a curse combined. "Adrian, it was Victoria. She's been manipulating both of us. The friendship, the lunches, the way she's been asking about our marriage. She's been planning this." Adrian's expression shifted from cold fury to something far more devastating: pity. "Victoria is the one who brought me this evidence, Elena. She's been protecting me while you've been betraying me. She didn't want to believe it either, but she couldn't stand by and watch you destroy me." The truth hit Elena like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for breath. Victoria hadn't just stolen her husband, she had orchestrated Elena's complete destruction with surgical precision. Every confidence Elena had shared, every vulnerability she had revealed, every moment of trust and friendship had been weaponized against her. "She's been sleeping with you," Elena said quietly, the pieces finally clicking into place. "The late nights, the distance between us, the way you look at me like you can barely stand the sight of me. She seduced you while pretending to be my friend, and now she's framing me to eliminate any competition." Adrian's silence was more damning than any denial could have been. Elena saw the truth in his face, in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, in the guilt that flickered across his features before hardening back into accusation. "Even if that were true," he said finally, "it doesn't explain this evidence. It doesn't explain $2 million in your account or photographs of you with my biggest competitor." Elena stared at the man she had loved for 7 years, the man she had built her life around, the man whose children she had dreamed of bearing. "The Adrian Kane I married would have known I was incapable of betraying him," she said quietly. "That man would have trusted me over evidence that could be fabricated by anyone with enough money and motivation. And the Elena Marquez I married wouldn't have sold me out to my enemies," Adrian replied, his voice breaking slightly on her maiden name. "But people change, don't they? Grief changes people. Loss makes them angry and resentful and desperate." The cruelty of his words, the way he turned her mother's death into a motive for betrayal, shattered something fundamental in Elena's heart. She realized in that moment that their marriage had been over long before Victoria's machinations began. Adrian's willingness to believe the worst of her, his complete inability to see through such obvious manipulation, revealed an absence of trust that no amount of love could overcome. "I loved you with everything I had," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I would have died before hurting you. If you can't see that, if you can believe I'm capable of this kind of betrayal, Then you never knew me at all. I thought I knew you, Adrian replied, gathering up the photographs and documents. But the woman I married wouldn't have done this to me. The woman I married wouldn't have made me fall in love with her just to destroy me from the inside out. The divorce proceedings that followed were a masterpiece of ruthless efficiency orchestrated by Adrian's legal team and designed to leave Elena with nothing but the clothes on her back. The prenuptial agreement she had signed in a haze of love and trust 7 years earlier proved to be her complete undoing, protecting Adrian's vast fortune while leaving her with no claim to the life they had built together. Elena's desperate attempts to prove her innocence fell on deaf ears. The evidence against her was too comprehensive, too professional, and too convincing for anyone to believe it could be fabricated. Private investigators confirmed the authenticity of the photographs through facial recognition technology. Forensic accountants verified that the money had indeed been deposited into accounts bearing her social security number and signature. Victoria, meanwhile, played her role as the reluctant witness to perfection. In her deposition, she spoke with heartbreaking sadness about watching Elena's behavior change over the months following her mother's death. She described Elena's growing resentment toward Adrian's success, her bitter comments about feeling trapped in a marriage to a man who cared more about money than emotional connection. I tried to be a good friend to her, Victoria testified, dabbing at her eyes with expensive tissues. I thought if I could just be patient and supportive, Elena would work through her grief and remember how much she loved Adrian. I never imagined she was capable of this kind of vindictive destruction. The media coverage was savage and unrelenting. Billionaire's wife's betrayal exposed screamed across tabloid headlines for weeks, accompanied by the most damaging photographs Victoria had provided. Elena's face became synonymous with gold-digging treachery, her name a cautionary tale whispered in the circles she had once called home. Friends and acquaintances who had seemed genuine in their affection abandoned Elena with the swift brutality of pack animals sensing weakness. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unreturned. The charity boards she had served on quietly removed her name from their rosters. In a matter of weeks, Elena found herself completely alone in a world that had once welcomed her with open arms. The studio apartment in Queens that became Elena's new home was a far cry from the Park Avenue penthouse she had shared with Adrian. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' television shows and arguments. The radiator clanked like a ghost in chains throughout the winter nights. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to stand in, and the single window faced a brick wall that blocked out most of the natural light. But it was hers, paid for with what little savings she had managed to accumulate before Adrian's lawyers froze all of her accounts. Elena had never realized how many aspects of daily life required credit and references until she found herself unable to qualify for anything better than this modest space in a neighborhood where no one knew or cared about her former life. The waitressing job at Rosario's, a family-owned Italian restaurant near her apartment, was the only work she could find once her identity became public knowledge. The owner, Mrs. Rosario, was an elderly Italian immigrant who judged people by their work ethic rather than their scandals, but even she looked at Elena with curiosity and wariness for the first few weeks. "You work hard," Mrs. Rosario observed one evening as Elena finished wiping down tables long after closing time. "Most people who've had easy lives don't know how to work hard. But you do." Elena smiled sadly, hanging her apron on the hook by the kitchen door. "I'm learning that I never knew what hard work was," she replied quietly. "I'm learning a lot of things I never knew before." The physical exhaustion of her new life was actually a blessing in disguise. After 12-hour shifts on her feet, carrying heavy trays and dealing with demanding customers, Elena fell into bed too tired to lie awake thinking about everything she had lost. The ache in her back and the burning in her feet became a welcome distraction from the deeper pain that lived in her chest. But it was during one of those exhausted evenings, as she soaked her swollen feet in a plastic basin while eating leftover pasta from the restaurant, that Elena discovered the secret that would change everything once again. The nausea she had attributed to stress and poor eating habits had persisted for weeks. The fatigue she had blamed on her grueling work schedule seemed disproportionate to her physical exertion. The pregnancy test she bought at the corner drugstore confirmed what her body had already begun telling her. 2 pink lines appeared almost immediately, clear and undeniable in their message. Elena stared at the test for a long time, her hands trembling as she processed the implications of what she was seeing. The timing was impossible to ignore. Based on her calculations, conception had occurred during one of the last intimate moments she and Adrian had shared, before Victoria's manipulation had completely poisoned their relationship. This child was the product of love, not betrayal, created during one of the rare nights when Adrian had seemed to remember that Elena was his wife and not just an unwelcome presence in his home. Elena's first instinct was to call Adrian immediately, to tell him about the baby and force him to confront the possibility that she had been telling the truth about Victoria's manipulation. Surely the news of a child would penetrate his anger and suspicion enough to make him question the narrative he had accepted so completely. But as Elena sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by the evidence of how thoroughly Adrian had destroyed her life based on fabricated evidence, she realized she couldn't risk exposing this child to his father's capacity for cruelty. If Adrian could believe her capable of corporate espionage and betrayal, what would he believe about her pregnancy? Would he assume she was trying to trap him with another man's child? Would he demand paternity tests and custody battles that would turn her baby into a weapon in their ongoing war? The decision to keep the secret was born from a mother's protective instinct that overrode every other consideration. He made his choice, Elena whispered to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her hand resting protectively over her still flat abdomen. Now I'll make mine. The move upstate to a small town called Millbrook was motivated by both practical and emotional considerations. Elena's savings wouldn't last much longer in New York City, and she needed to disappear completely before her pregnancy became visible. The town was small enough that she could potentially avoid recognition while still being close enough to decent medical care. The cottage Elena rented was smaller than her Queens apartment, but surrounded by the kind of natural beauty she had forgotten existed during her years in Manhattan's concrete jungle. Trees older than the nation itself created a canopy of green that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns across her windows. A small garden behind the house had been neglected by previous tenants, but showed signs of once being carefully tended. Elena found work at a local diner called Maggie's, where the customers were mostly farmers, construction workers, and traveling salesmen who had never heard of Kane International or the scandal that had destroyed her previous life. For the first time in months, Elena could simply be Elena, not Adrian's ex-wife, not the woman who had allegedly betrayed a billionaire, just a pregnant woman working hard to build a new life for herself and her child. The pregnancy became Elena's source of strength and hope during the darkest period of her life. As her body changed and grew, she found herself talking to the baby during quiet moments, sharing her plans and dreams for their future together. "We'll have a good life," she would whisper, her hands tracing circles over her expanding belly. "It won't be easy, and it won't be what I once thought I wanted, but it will be honest and real and filled with love." Lucas Adrian Marquez was born on a snowy February morning after 18 hours of labor that tested every limit of Elena's endurance. Elena had insisted on using only her maiden name on all the hospital documents, determined to protect her son from any connection to the Kane family legacy. But when the nurses placed the tiny perfect baby in her arms, Elena couldn't stop the tears that came from seeing Adrian's face reflected in miniature. Lucas had his father's dark hair and strong jawline, his mother's deep brown eyes, and an expression of serious concentration that seemed impossibly mature for someone only minutes old. Elena traced the delicate features with one fingertip, marveling at the miracle of this small person who represented the best of both his parents despite the circumstances of his conception. "I'll protect you from his world of lies," Elena promised her sleeping son as snow fell beyond the hospital window. "You'll know what it means to be truly loved, unconditionally and completely. That's something I can give you that all his money never could." The years that followed were defined by struggle, sacrifice, and a fierce kind of joy that Elena had never experienced before. She worked multiple jobs to support herself and Lucas, morning shifts at the diner, afternoon hours at a local farm stand, evening work doing bookkeeping for small businesses from her kitchen table. Every dollar was precious, every expense carefully considered, but they had everything they truly needed. Lucas grew into a bright, curious child who seemed to absorb knowledge like a sponge and approached the world with the same intensity Elena remembered from his father. But where Adrian's intensity had often manifested as ruthless ambition, Lucas channeled his into genuine wonder about everything from the life cycle of butterflies to the way music could make people feel different emotions. Elena told herself she was protecting her son by keeping him away from Adrian's world of wealth and deception, but late at night when Lucas was sleeping, she sometimes wondered if she was also protecting herself. The thought of facing Adrian again, of seeing his reaction to the son he didn't know existed, filled her with a terror that had nothing to do with financial security and everything to do with the possibility that he might try to take Lucas away from her. 3 years passed in this careful isolation, with Elena building a quiet life that revolved entirely around her son's needs and happiness. She had almost convinced herself that they could remain hidden forever, that Adrian would never discover the secret she guarded so fiercely. But across the state, in his Manhattan penthouse where Victoria now reigned as his wife in all but name, Adrian was planning what he believed would be his final victory over the woman who had betrayed him so completely. The wedding invitation he was preparing to send would serve as Elena's ultimate humiliation, a formal announcement that he had moved on completely and found happiness with the woman who had saved him from Elena's lies. Little did Adrian know that Elena had her own surprise waiting, one that would shatter his carefully constructed new reality and force him to confront the possibility that the greatest lie of all had been the one he told himself about the woman he had once promised to love forever. The morning Adrian Kane announced his engagement to Victoria, he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, Manhattan sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. At 34, he had everything a man could theoretically want: a business empire worth billions, a stunning fiancée who understood his world, and the satisfaction of having survived the greatest betrayal of his life. But as he gazed out at the city that had witnessed his rise and fall and rise again, Adrian felt the familiar hunger for something more than success. He wanted Elena to know exactly what she had lost. The engagement itself had been as calculated as any merger Adrian had ever orchestrated. Victoria had proven herself invaluable over the past 3 years, not just as a lover but as a strategic partner who understood the ruthless mathematics of power. She had connections throughout Europe that opened doors to markets Adrian had been trying to penetrate for years. Her family's shipping empire provided synergies that would save Kane International millions annually. Most importantly, she had stood by him when his world threatened to crumble, offering loyalty when his own wife had chosen betrayal. The announcement should go out to all the major papers simultaneously, Victoria said as she glided into his office, her silk robe flowing behind her like water. Even in the morning light, without makeup or professional styling, she was breathtakingly beautiful in a way that still caught Adrian off guard. "I want to control the narrative from the beginning." Adrian turned from the window, studying the woman who would soon bear his name. Victoria's beauty was undeniable, but it was her mind that had truly captured his attention. She thought like he did, strategically and without sentimentality, understanding that every public appearance and every statement would be analyzed by competitors and allies alike. The wedding should be significant, he said, moving to pour himself coffee from the silver service Victoria had arranged. 500 guests minimum. The Plaza Ballroom. I want it to be the social event of the season. Victoria smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "Are you trying to prove something, darling? Because if this is about showing Elena what she lost, I should remind you that she's hardly in a position to attend Manhattan society weddings." The mention of his ex-wife's name sent a familiar spike of anger through Adrian's chest. Elena had disappeared so completely after their divorce that his private investigators had struggled to locate her even when legally necessary. The last reliable sighting had been in some small upstate town where she was reportedly working as a waitress, a fall from grace so complete it should have satisfied his need for revenge. But it hadn't. "She'll see the coverage," Adrian said, his voice carrying the edge that appeared whenever Elena entered his thoughts. "Every magazine, every newspaper, every social media platform will be talking about our wedding. She'll know that I didn't just survive her betrayal, I thrived because of it." Victoria moved behind him, her hands settling on his shoulders with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly how to comfort and manipulate simultaneously. "You've built something magnificent," she murmured against his ear. "Kane International is stronger than ever. You're more powerful than ever. She's working in a diner in some forgotten town while you're about to marry into one of Europe's most influential families. Isn't that revenge enough?" Adrian leaned back against her, feeling the familiar comfort of Victoria's unwavering confidence in his worth and potential. She was right, of course. By every measurable standard, he had won their war completely. Elena had lost everything: her home, her social standing, her financial security, her reputation. Meanwhile, Adrian had emerged stronger and more successful than ever before. But late at night, when Victoria slept beside him in silk pajamas that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, Adrian sometimes found himself remembering moments from his marriage that didn't fit neatly into his narrative of betrayal and justified revenge. Elena laughing at his terrible jokes. Elena falling asleep with her head on his shoulder during long flights. Elena's face the morning after they made love, soft and trusting in ways that now seemed impossible to reconcile with corporate espionage and calculated destruction. "I want her to receive a formal invitation," Adrian said suddenly, the words emerging from some dark corner of his psyche where revenge still burned like banked coals. "Hand-delivered to whatever hovel she's living in now." Victoria's hand stilled on his shoulders, and Adrian could feel her surprise in the subtle tension of her muscles. "Adrian, That seems unnecessarily cruel. And potentially problematic if she decides to actually attend. She won't come, Adrian said with the confidence of a man who had spent 3 years studying the psychology of the woman he had once loved and now despised. Elena's too proud and too ashamed to show her face among people who know what she did. But she'll hold that invitation in her hands and imagine what it would have been like to be the bride instead of the disgraced exile. That's the image I want burned into her memory forever. The invitation itself was a work of art, designed by the same firm that had created wedding announcements for European royalty. Heavy cream cardstock embedded with gold thread, calligraphy so perfect it looked like medieval illumination, wording that managed to be both elegant and subtly cruel in its formality. Adrian spent an extraordinary amount of time perfecting every detail, understanding that this single piece of paper would serve as both announcement and final insult. Victoria threw herself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of a general preparing for campaign, understanding instinctively that this event would serve multiple purposes beyond celebrating their union. It would announce her complete integration into New York's elite circles, while simultaneously demonstrating Adrian's absolute recovery from his first marriage's spectacular failure. Every detail was calibrated for maximum impact. The guest list read like a who's who of business and society. The floral arrangements would cost more than most people's houses. The entertainment would include performers typically reserved for heads of state. But as the weeks passed and wedding preparations consumed their lives, Adrian found himself thinking more and more about Elena's potential reaction to receiving their invitation. Would she cry? Would she rage? Would she finally understand the magnitude of what her betrayal had cost them both? The anticipation of her pain had become almost as intoxicating as the prospect of marrying Victoria. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in the small town of Millbrook, Elena Marquez was living a life so far removed from Adrian's world of power and revenge that she might as well have been on another planet. Her cottage sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees that turned spectacular shades of red and gold each fall, their branches creating a canopy that filtered sunlight into dancing patterns across her small front yard. The morning the invitation arrived, Elena was in her garden with Lucas, teaching him to identify different types of flowers while they weeded the vegetable patch she had planted behind the house. At 4 years old, Lucas had inherited his father's intense curiosity and his mother's gentle patience, asking endless questions about everything from why roses had thorns to whether worms felt lonely underground. "Mama, look." Lucas pointed excitedly at a butterfly that had landed on a nearby sunflower, its orange and black wings opening and closing like it was breathing. "It's so pretty. Why doesn't it stay still?" Elena smiled, wiping dirt from her hands as she knelt beside her son. "Butterflies are always moving because they're looking for the best flowers to visit. They can't stay in one place for too long, or they'll miss all the beautiful things waiting for them somewhere else." The metaphor wasn't lost on Elena herself. Over the past 3 years, she had learned to find beauty and meaning in a life that would have seemed impossible during her years as Mrs. Adrian Kane. The simple pleasure of growing her own food, the satisfaction of work that left her physically tired but emotionally fulfilled, the pure joy of watching Lucas discover the world with wonder and excitement. These weren't the dreams she had once held, but they had become something more valuable, genuine happiness built on truth rather than illusion. When the mail carrier knocked on her front door that afternoon, Elena assumed it was another package delivery for Mrs. Henderson next door, who frequently ordered craft supplies online. But the young man in the postal service uniform held an envelope that made Elena's blood freeze in her veins. Heavy, expensive stationery addressed to Ms. Elena Marquez in handwriting she didn't recognize, with a return address that belonged to one of Manhattan's most exclusive wedding planning firms. "Special delivery, ma'am," the mail carrier said politely, seemingly oblivious to the way Elena's hands trembled as she signed for the envelope. "Somebody wanted to make sure you got this personally." Elena waited until the mail carrier had driven away before opening the envelope with hands that shook so badly she nearly tore the precious cardstock inside. The words swam before her eyes as she read them once, twice, 3 times before their meaning fully penetrated her consciousness. "Mr. Adrian Kane and Ms. Victoria Kane Sterling request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration." The date was less than a month away. The location was the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom. The tone was formally polite and subtly devastating, written in the language of high society that managed to be both welcoming and exclusionary simultaneously. But what struck Elena most powerfully wasn't the invitation itself. It was the realization that Adrian had wanted her to receive it personally, had gone to the trouble and expense of tracking down her address specifically so she would know about his happiness with the woman who had destroyed their marriage. "Mama." Lucas appeared in the doorway, his small face creased with concern. "You look sad." Are you hurt? Elena quickly folded the invitation and tucked it into her pocket, forcing her face into a smile that felt like it might crack under the pressure. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just surprised by something in the mail. But as she helped Lucas wash the garden dirt from his hands and prepared their simple dinner of pasta and vegetables from their garden, Elena's mind was racing through possibilities and fears that she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. Adrian was marrying Victoria. The woman who had methodically destroyed Elena's life was about to achieve her ultimate victory. And somewhere in Manhattan, surrounded by luxury and power, no one knew that Adrian Kane had a son who carried his eyes and his intensity and his stubborn determination to understand how everything worked. That night, after Lucas was asleep in his small bedroom decorated with drawings he had made of butterflies and spaceships, Elena sat at her kitchen table staring at the wedding invitation under the harsh fluorescent light. The gold embossing caught the light like tiny stars, and she found herself remembering another invitation, years ago, when she had been the bride and the world had seemed full of endless possibility. She thought about ignoring the invitation completely, continuing the quiet life she had built for herself and Lucas in their small town where no one knew about billionaires or corporate espionage or the kind of betrayal that made headlines. It would be safer for Lucas, certainly, and easier for her own battered heart. Adrian had made his choice 3 years ago when he believed lies over love. Why should she risk exposing herself and her son to more pain and humiliation? But as Elena sat in her modest kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life she had built through determination and sacrifice, she realized she was tired of hiding. Tired of shame over crimes she hadn't committed. Tired of allowing Victoria's lies to define her story. Most of all, she was tired of her son growing up without knowing his father, even if that father had proven himself capable of cruelty that still took her breath away. It's time he knew the truth, Elena whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice carrying a resolve that surprised her with its strength. The decision, once made, required preparation that consumed Elena's thoughts and meager savings for the following weeks. She needed to look the part of someone who belonged at a Plaza Hotel wedding, which meant finding a dress that could compete with the designer gowns that would fill that ballroom. More importantly, she needed armor for the battle she was about to walk into, something that would make her feel powerful and beautiful and worthy of the truth she carried. The midnight blue silk gown she found at a consignment shop in Albany had belonged to someone who understood elegance and quality. The dress had clearly been expensive when new, though Elena couldn't afford to think too hard about how much of her carefully hoarded savings she was spending on this single garment. When she tried it on in the shop's cramped fitting room, Elena saw a woman in the mirror who looked like she could hold her own in any ballroom in the world. The color brought out the depth of her brown eyes and complemented the olive tone of her skin that 3 years of outdoor work had given her. The cut was sophisticated without being flashy, elegant without trying too hard. Most importantly, when Elena looked at herself in that dress, she saw not the broken woman who had been cast out of Adrian's world, but the strong mother who had built a new life from nothing and was now ready to fight for her son's future. Lucas was fascinated by the preparations, though Elena kept her explanations vague and age-appropriate. "We're going to New York City to attend a very fancy party," she told him as she helped him into the small navy suit she had found at a children's store. "There will be lots of important people there, and I need you to be on your very best behavior." "Will there be cake?" Lucas asked with the priorities of a 4-year-old, his dark hair combed neatly but already showing signs of the cowlick that made him look even more like his father. "I'm sure there will be cake," Elena replied, straightening his tiny bow tie and marveling at how handsome he looked. "You look like a little prince, Lucas." Lucas beamed at the compliment, spinning in front of the mirror to watch his suit jacket flare out around him. "You look like a princess, Mama," he said seriously. "Like the ones in my storybooks, but prettier." Elena's heart clenched with love and terror as she looked at her son, Adrian's son, dressed up for the most important confrontation of their lives. Lucas had no idea that in a few hours, he would meet the father who didn't know he existed. Elena prayed she was making the right choice, that protecting Lucas's right to know his father outweighed the risks of exposing him to a man who had proven himself capable of breathtaking cruelty when he felt betrayed. The drive to Manhattan took 3 hours, during which Elena rehearsed what she would say and tried to prepare herself mentally for seeing Adrian again. Lucas napped in his car seat for most of the journey, his small face peaceful and trusting in a way that made Elena's chest tight with protective love. Whatever happened at this wedding, she was determined that her son would emerge unscathed. The Plaza Hotel rose before them like a palace from a fairy tale, its facade gleaming in the afternoon sun and its entrance bustling with guests in formal attire. Elena parked several blocks away, unwilling to surrender her car to valet parking that would trap them at the hotel if they needed to leave quickly. As they walked toward the hotel, Lucas's small hand secure in hers, Elena felt like she was marching toward a battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than her son's future. "Mama, it's so big," Lucas whispered as they approached the hotel's ornate entrance, his eyes wide with wonder at the grandeur surrounding them. "Do kings and queens live here?" "Sometimes," Elena replied, smoothing his hair one final time before they entered the lobby. "Today, we're the royal visitors." The plaza's grand ballroom had been transformed into something beyond opulent. It was a shrine to wealth and power that took Elena's breath away despite her determination to remain unimpressed. Crystal chandeliers that had witnessed decades of New York's most important celebrations cast rainbow patterns across walls draped in silk and adorned with floral arrangements that must have cost more than Elena earned in a year. 500 guests in couture gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos filled the space with a kind of elegant chatter that Elena had once navigated effortlessly but now felt as foreign as a different language. At the altar, beneath an arch of white orchids and roses that reached nearly to the ballroom's soaring ceiling, Adrian Kane stood waiting for his bride. Elena's first glimpse of him in 3 years hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak with the force of remembered love and present pain. He looked magnificent in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, every inch the powerful billionaire who commanded respect and admiration wherever he went. But there was something different about him, something harder and more distant than the man she had married 7 years ago. Victoria appeared at the ballroom's opposite entrance like something from a fashion magazine, her Chanel wedding gown flowing behind her in waves of ivory silk and French lace. She was breathtakingly beautiful, Elena had to admit, carrying herself with the confidence of a woman who had never doubted her right to occupy the highest echelons of society. The assembled guests rose to their feet as she began her procession down the aisle, every eye in the room focused on the woman who was about to become the second Mrs. Adrian Kane. Elena stood at the back of the ballroom with Lucas beside her, hidden among the other guests but close enough to see Adrian's face as he watched his bride approach. There was satisfaction in his expression, and possessiveness, and what might have been genuine affection. But Elena, who had once known every expression that crossed his features, could see that whatever Adrian felt for Victoria, it wasn't the consuming love that had once existed between them. The ceremony was moments from beginning when Elena made her decision to stop hiding in the shadows. She had come here to confront the truth, not to observe from a distance like a ghost haunting the edges of her former life. Taking Lucas's hand firmly in hers, Elena began walking down the side aisle toward the front of the ballroom, her midnight blue gown flowing around her like liquid courage. The first person to notice them was a woman in the third row who had been part of Elena's former social circle. Elena saw recognition dawn in the woman's eyes, followed immediately by shock and barely concealed excitement at the drama about to unfold. The whisper that followed rippled through the nearby guests like wildfire. Is that Elena? Adrian's first wife. But it was the child beside Elena that truly captured everyone's attention. Lucas walked with the serious dignity of someone who understood this was an important moment, his small hand secure in his mother's as they moved through the crowd of strangers. And every person who saw him felt the same jolt of recognition. This child was unmistakably Adrian Kane's son, from his dark hair and strong jawline to the intelligent intensity in his brown eyes. The murmur that began in whispers quickly escalated to audible gasps as more guests registered what they were seeing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. Even the string quartet faltered, their elegant processional music stumbling as the musicians caught sight of the drama unfolding in their midst. Adrian, still standing at the altar waiting for his bride, turned to see what had caused the disturbance in his perfect wedding. Elena watched his confident smile falter and then disappear entirely as his eyes found her across the crowded ballroom. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, former husband and wife stared at each other across the years and pain that separated them. But it was when Adrian's gaze dropped to the child beside Elena that his carefully constructed world began to crumble. Elena saw the exact moment recognition hit him, the way his face went white beneath his tan, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the way his entire body went rigid with shock. Adrian Kane, who had built an empire through his ability to think quickly and adapt to changing circumstances, stood frozen like a statue as he stared at the miniature version of himself standing in his ballroom. Victoria, still making her way down the aisle in blissful ignorance of the drama unfolding behind her, finally noticed that something was wrong when she reached the altar and found Adrian staring past her with an expression she had never seen before. She turned to follow his gaze, and Elena watched Victoria's face drain of all color as she saw the woman she had destroyed standing in the back of the ballroom with undeniable proof that her victory had never been complete. The silence that fell over the ballroom was complete and profound, as if 500 people had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. Camera flashes began popping from hired photographers, though Elena doubted any of those images would ever make it into society magazines. Lucas pressed closer to his mother's side, sensing the tension in the room even if he couldn't understand its source. "Mama," he whispered, his small voice carrying in the absolute quiet, "everyone is looking at us." Elena squeezed his hand gently, drawing strength from his presence and his trust in her judgment. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured back, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. "We belong here." Adrian found his voice first, though it came out rough and strained. "What is this, Elena?" The question carried across the silent ballroom like an accusation, but Elena could hear the underlying shock and confusion that he was struggling to control. Elena lifted her chin, drawing on 3 years of hard-won strength and dignity. When she spoke, her voice was clear and calm, designed to carry to every corner of the ballroom. "This is Lucas," she said simply. "Your son." The words hit the assembled guests like a physical blow, generating gasps and murmurs that Victoria tried desperately to override. "She's lying." Victoria's voice was shrill with panic, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of her collapsing schemes. "This is another one of her schemes. She's trying to ruin our wedding with lies and manipulation." But Elena had prepared for this moment, had spent 3 years gathering evidence and documentation that would be impossible to dispute. From her small purse, she withdrew a folder containing Lucas's birth certificate, medical records, and most importantly, the DNA test results she had obtained using hair from Adrian's old brush that Maria had saved before being fired from the Kane household. "The dates prove conception occurred before our divorce," Elena said, her voice cutting through Victoria's desperate protests. "I have documentation that will verify everything I'm telling you. Lucas is your son, Adrian. He was conceived during one of the last nights we were truly together as husband and wife." Adrian's mind, trained by years of complex business negotiations, immediately began calculating timelines and possibilities. Elena could see him processing the information, his sharp intelligence cutting through the shock to analyze the facts she had presented. And she could see the moment he realized she was telling the truth, the way his shoulders sagged slightly, the way his eyes filled with a pain that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with devastating loss. "You were pregnant," Adrian said quietly, his voice barely audible but carrying to Elena across the silent ballroom. "When I accused you, when I divorced you, when I threw you out of our home, you were carrying my child." The statement hung in the air like an indictment, and Elena saw several guests exchange meaningful glances as they processed the implications. Adrian Kane, Manhattan's most ruthless businessman, had destroyed his pregnant wife based on fabricated evidence, throwing her into poverty and exile while she carried his son. Elena nodded once, her composure never wavering despite the magnitude of the moment. "I tried to tell you," she said simply. "But you had already decided I was guilty of betraying you. You wouldn't listen to anything I had to say." The silence that followed was broken by Victoria's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of the narrative. But her protests were becoming shriller and less coherent as she realized that her elaborate deception was finally unraveling in the most public way possible. The guests were no longer looking at her as the triumphant bride. They were staring at her with a growing recognition that she might have been the architect of one of Manhattan's most devastating scandals. Elena reached into her folder again, withdrawing documentation that represented 3 years of careful investigation and patient gathering of evidence. "I also have proof of what really happened 3 years ago," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Victoria's real background, the affair she conducted with my husband while pretending to be my friend, and most importantly, evidence of how she fabricated the corporate espionage charges that destroyed our marriage." The revelation sent shockwaves through the ballroom as guests realized they were witnessing not just the exposure of a secret child, but the complete unraveling of one of the most talked-about scandals in recent New York society history. Adrian's face went through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally, a rage so profound it seemed to transform his features into something Elena barely recognized. When Adrian's fury finally found its target, it wasn't Elena he turned toward with blazing eyes. Instead, he looked at Victoria with the expression of a man who had just realized he had been played for a fool by someone he had trusted completely. "You destroyed my family," he said, his voice low and deadly. "You made me throw away the only real love I ever had for lies and manipulation, and your own selfish ambition." Victoria's last desperate attempts to maintain her fiction crumbled under the weight of Adrian's accusation and the documentation Elena had provided. The wedding guests, Manhattan's elite who had gathered to celebrate what they thought was a triumph of love over betrayal, instead found themselves witnesses to the exposure of a deception so elaborate and cruel it left many of them speechless. Lucas, throughout this adult drama he couldn't fully understand, had stayed close to his mother's side with the intuitive wisdom of a child who knew something important was happening. But as the voices in the ballroom grew louder and more emotional, he pressed closer to Elena, his small face reflecting confusion and concern. "Mama," he whispered, tugging at her dress, "why is everyone shouting? Are they angry at us?" Elena knelt down to Lucas's level, gathering him into her arms and speaking softly enough that only he could hear. "Some people are upset because they're learning things they didn't know before," she explained gently. "But you don't need to be scared. Mama's here, and I won't let anything bad happen to you." But even as Elena comforted her son, she could see that the confrontation was far from over. Adrian stood at the altar in his wedding tuxedo, surrounded by the wreckage of his carefully planned revenge and the ruins of his relationship with Victoria, staring at the child he hadn't known existed with an expression of loss so profound it made Elena's heart ache despite everything he had put her through. In that moment, surrounded by 500 witnesses to the most dramatic reversal of fortune Manhattan society had seen in years, Adrian Kane finally understood the true cost of his inability to trust the woman he had once promised to love forever. He had missed 3 years of his son's life, destroyed the only genuine love he had ever known, and built his new happiness on a foundation of lies that had just crumbled beneath his feet. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but visible in every face in that ballroom, was whether love and truth could possibly survive the devastation that pride and deception had wrought. Elena held her son close and waited to see if the man she had once loved completely was still capable of choosing his family over his wounded ego. But that answer would have to wait, because Lucas was looking up at the tall man in the tuxedo with the intelligent curiosity that was his birthright, and Elena realized that whatever happened between her and Adrian, her son deserved the chance to know his father, even if that father had proven himself capable of breaking hearts with surgical precision. The silence stretched across the ballroom like a held breath, 500 people waiting to see how this impossible situation would resolve itself. And in that silence, Elena found herself hoping against hope that the man she had once loved was still somewhere inside the stranger who had been cruel enough to send her a wedding invitation, but human enough to recognize his own child's face staring back at him from across a crowded room.